The Inkatha Freedom Party is one of South Africa's biggest political parties. Established in 1975, it is the second oldest party still active in the country's political landscape. In recent times, the IFP has been trying to shed its image as a provincially based party, mainly supported by Zulu-speaking South Africans. But is it succeeding? Good evening, I am Sizwe Mpofu Walsh, and welcome to this episode of Unfiltered. As political parties scramble to mount formidable campaigns to win the 2024 national elections, they also must contend with the reality of murky coalitions that have so far proven that in politics, there are no permanent friends or enemies. The IFP has had its fair share of problematic coalitions as it tries to regain control of the KwaZulu-Natal province. Tonight, we ask, can the IFP increase its support base nationally? And joining me for this conversation is the IFP's national spokesperson, Nkululeko Hlengwa. Before we embark on our conversation, let's watch the scene setter produced by Jacqueline Maphala.
Long live the spirit of the President Emeritus, long live. Fike isikhathi la engiyobe sengidedele khona omunye kodwa impilo yami yonke ukubonga kwami ngiyokunikela ekutheni ngibe yisebenzi senu ukubonga lenhlonipho eninginikeze yona osukwini lwanamhlanje.
Emerging as the new uncontested president of the IFP in August of 2019, Velenkosini Hlabisa was the new face of the party, expected to steer it to a new direction, shedding its Zulu nationalist identity 44 years since its establishment. Established in 1975 by Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the party's history is one of the highly contested topics in the country. The party has been accused of a deliberate distortion of history about its involvement in violence in townships, where its self-protection units were accused of the widespread killings of civilians. But the IFP has always insisted that while Buthelezi refused to support the armed struggle and sanctions, it's always supported the liberation struggle and the release of Nelson Mandela. It was one of the 19 political party organizations represented at the CODESA negotiations, charting a path for South Africa. Post-apartheid South Africa brought challenges for a party that has always had the majority support in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. For the first time in 2004, the IFP lost its position as the majority party to the ANC, after registering just over 50% in 1994. One of its biggest tasks going into the 2024 national elections is to convince the country that it is truly a national organization and not a nationalist Zulu organization that appeals only to those who identify as Zulu. The party's attempt to reinvent itself is seen with its incorporation of women and the youth in its leadership structures, with SCOPA chairperson Nkululeko Hlengwa being one of the most recognizable faces. The IFP says its vision is to promote the spirit of Ubuntu, uphold the values of solidarity and freedom, as well as believing in unity in diversity. Can the IFP be a truly national political party? Jacqueline Maphala, Unfiltered.
Mr. Hlengwa, always a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks for joining us.
That's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having us. Good evening to you and the viewers at home.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Of course, it's a sensitive time for your President Emeritus. And of course, without wanting to infringe on his privacy and his family's privacy, are you able to update us on just how well he is at the moment?
No, let me, on behalf of the Buthelezi family and Buthelezi clan, thank all South Africans and people of the world who have been sending messages and prayers and support to the family and to Prince Buthelezi. We are very happy with his progress. Is doing very well, and we're expecting him to be home soon, but to give him the space and time, of course, to recuperate. We've got full confidence in his medical team, that's looking at the issues that are affecting him. So from a party point of view, we are receiving updates from the family from time to time, or as and when it's necessary. And we are quite happy with what we've been updated so far. So he's doing quite well, and we expect him to be up and running in no time.
And I'm sure if there are any further changes, we'll hear those from you
Most
in due
definitely,
course.
the family is going to be communicating, as already committed that they'll do so. But the prince is doing well.
Thanks for that update and for being quite open about that. On questions of leadership, of course, Mr. SABC is the president of the IFP, having succeeded the president emeritus. And there have been reports that there is internal fighting. Is this all just a bit of a mountain out of a molehill, or are there serious internal squabbles going on within the party at the moment?
There's no serious challenges in the party. In fact, as President SABC said on Tuesday, the party is solid and united on its onward course to 2024. You look at the work we are doing in by-elections. You can't get that kind of success if you're divided. So we do know, of course, that there's wishful thinking on the part of our detractors. But what we must not run away from, of course, is the fact that any political party is a platform of debate and engagement. And that happens in the IFP, and there will be differences. But they must not be confused with divisions. They must not be confused with problems. For any democracy to grow, whether in a party or a country, it must be anchored in discussions and negotiations. Prince Buthelezi always makes the point that let us agree to agree without being disagreeable. That's the strength of democracy. So I'm pleasantly surprised that there's this ongoing talk to the extent to which has been characterized, whereas actually it's not a reality. And I think the final point on this is to say we recognize as the IFP that we are a public good, we're a public entity, and we will be accountable. So as and when things arise, which we believe must be communicated, including but not limited to problems, we'll communicate them to South Africans.
There's been some reporting growing about your president's safety, that there's been an increase in his security detail, something you actually mentioned recently on Unfiltered. Can you give us more insight into that and exactly whether you have any worries about the safety of your president?
In the first instance, ordinarily, the IFP provides security and private security to its leadership, so that there's that protection, obviously. The SABC from time to time will conduct threats analysis. And the latest report from the SABC, so not from us, so the people well placed to give the nuanced details would be the SABC. This happens across the party political spectrum. Political leaders have security from SABC or the other way around. What we're not going to do, of course, is then discuss the content of those security threats in public to arm those whom are the threat in terms of knowing what we know and then being able to change plans. We are quite confident that the security we are providing, coupled with that of the SABC, is sufficient and will enable the president to continue doing his work. We, of course, remain worried about the volatility, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, and other provinces in Mpumalanga, where political violence or the killing of political leaders is rearing its ugly head again. So there is a clarion call on our part that the SAPS need to do more and better in investigating these crimes, so that as a deterrent, they can actually put people behind bars. It's very, very slow. There are cases which are very old and they've not been brought to a logical legal conclusion. So that's a problem. But as things stand now, we are quite confident that we've been able to push back on those threats by beefing up security. And the SABC, well, they've got a duty actually, and I think they're performing it.
The president has been also under some criticism. To be fair, not a majority in the party, but I think around 20 members had a problem with him addressing party events with people wearing T-shirts of his face when that's against internal policy. That disagreement was ultimately warded off and didn't even make it to your National Executive Council, if I'm not mistaken.
National Council, yes.
But we've got Tami Zulu also talk I beg your pardon, Tami Tami Ntuli,
Yeah.
the KZN provincial secretary, there's also talk of him potentially rising to challenge from his position within KZN. The president's security detail being beefed up. Am I drawing too many?
You are drawing.
Am I connecting too many dots? Or is there something deeper here within the IFP's leadership that South Africans need to be?
The issues are fundamentally differently compartmentalized, and in many instances there's no nexus. Obviously, a political space is very volatile and it moves. There's things that happen. So, part one, the decision about the T-shirts is a 2019 conference decision. That the face of Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi as the founder and President Emeritus will remain on party branding and party regalia. And we've re-emphasized that. Yes, it did happen that certain members started producing T-shirts with the face of President Hlabisa, and that matter was dealt with to the extent to which the directives and reminders, because you see, this is a conference decision, so anything outside that would be in breach of the party. The issue of the National Council members who gave a petition, it was not something that we viewed in a bad light. But we were concerned about the fact that, one, the petition was vague. Two, we do not believe the party has reached crisis point that there's needs for petition. So that's why we had an engagement. They raised in the main two issues. They did want the matter clarified insofar as T-shirts as a reminder, and the NEC advised that that decision stands. So there's no problem with that. And then, of course, it was an issue around state of readiness of the party for 2024, particularly around branches, because the branches are the basic unit of party mobilization. The IFP is a membership-based party. There are 888 branches which are ready for inauguration, above and beyond those that have already been inaugurated. So the Office of the SG will fast-track that process of inauguration. So those issues have been dealt with. Otherwise, there's no challenge to the leadership. The final point around the provincial chairperson Tami Ntuli and the IFP president Velenkosini Hlabisa, I think it's unfounded speculation, knowing the healthy working relationship that the two leaders have, and knowing the fact that obviously KwaZulu-Natal is our base, and so there does need to be heightened focus on ensuring that the party grows and is strong ahead of the elections, as we use that as a platform for national growth, as we're already expanding the party's operations to other provinces. What I think would be reckless and irresponsible is to throw, and this is not saying you're doing it, but because it's an issue in the public domain, to cast aspersions on the provincial chairperson, Tami Ntuli, because we fundamentally believe if he had been the source of these threats, the SABC would have acted on it. They would have done something insofar as he is concerned. So I think it's very unfair that he has to receive this kind of treatment. And at the same time, I think it's unfair that President Hlabisa's security becomes a talk of public discourse on such a sensitive matter. What I can assure you of is that there is a healthy working relationship between the two leaders, the provincial chair and the president. In fact, the provincial chair is a member of the National Executive Committee. So we believe as a party that teamwork is our strength. And yes, there's a hierarchy, right? But ultimately, some are foot soldiers. We must be on the ground. Door to door. We must be at by-elections. We must be at campaigns, membership drives, and so on. And so, because that's the nature of the party, there's assumptions. The final point: there's no contestation to the position of president because there's no vacancy. And that is a matter that will arrive at conference. I'm spoken to the provincial chair of KwaZulu-Natal and said, hey man, these things, and he's just as surprised. There's a Zulu expression, so why would anybody want to say something that is not there? So here's the thing, we are focused on the elections. So our detractors are worried. Look at the by-election trajectory. Look at the growth trajectory. Look at how the IFP is winning wards off other political parties. We are a party on a growth trajectory. So we are not surprised that there will be this is pity on the side and this anxiety on the side. And I go back to what I said. If there's a problem, we'll communicate it, because we owe that to our members and the country. So those things, ingwanegwan.
Just briefly before we go to break, there's also a danger of the growth trajectory, because no one can deny that you had a great election in 2021, that things are looking promising from the electoral perspective, but that also creates opportunities, that also creates questions in the minds of those who see power before them. And do you think that you're capable of handling the growth without internal combustion?
That's the poison chalice of growth, that you invite all sorts of unsavory elements who may want to, ride on the back of your success. But I fundamentally believe that the systems in place that the party has in ensuring that we safeguard the collective integrity of the party are sufficient, including but not limited to cooling off periods. There's a very extensive list committee process that the party engages in vetting, candidates and so on. In fact, next week, the Election Management Committee, or as we call it, the DMC, Daily Management, will be meeting. Amongst others, we're finalizing processes. So nobody's going to come in through the back door, through the window. There's processes precisely so that we don't, get infiltrated by unsavory elements.
Let's go to break. Sure. When we come back, we'll talk about the IFP in government, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, but in other parts of the country, and assess their record and think how that might affect the 2024 national election, which is just a few months away. Don't go anywhere. Let's continue this conversation on Unfiltered after the break. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're in conversation with national spokesperson of the IFP, Mkhuleko Hlengwa. Mr. Hlengwa, let's move on to governance, because in actual fact, you govern in many councils in KwaZulu-Natal, especially after 2021, where you really improved your share of the vote in the local elections. At the beginning of this year, we saw a breakdown in the EFF-IFP pact, particularly in 8 hung municipalities. To what extent do you share any of the blame for the breakdown of that pact? And do you regret anything that happened in the breakdown of that pact?
Without sounding arrogant, we did nothing wrong. It was an entirely EFF decision for interests that only they can explain. And we believe that it was a missed opportunity, in fact. And I think that the EFF realizes now that they've not served their interests well. We believe that the working relationship we had at local level with the EFF was a productive and fruitful one. So the decision that they took is probably one that they calculated, that works for them. But we do believe that it was a missed opportunity, and it's something which has not served interest well. Obviously, in certain parts, it's caused instability. Too, we're not ignorant to the fact that them walking away would have caused us losses in some of the municipalities, but that's the nature of coalitions, right? So we are strengthening our gains where we believe that opportunity presents itself. The one thing we're not going to do is govern at all costs. See, so if it happens that we are out of power, then we are. It will not be the first time that we're on the opposition benches. You know that in 2011, the IFP only got 2 municipalities, 2, Ulundi and Umsing.
And now you're what, just shy of 30?
We are just shy of 30. Yeah. So we've been down that road before, and we know what it takes to rebound and work hard. I would say that because there was this misconception that was created that it seemed as if the IFP was being hard-headed. We made practical and tangible offers to the EFF to ensure that we continued working together. Well, it didn't happen. And what followed was very unpleasant then, because they began, throwing mud. And I don't think that's because they realized, what you see, they calculated almost 13, 15 municipalities that we'd lose. And when it didn't happen, they then engaged in that kind of mudslinging politics. It's not our style, and we won't respond to it in kind, but we will correct the nonsense if it comes out. Ultimately, though, we do believe that it's a missed opportunity that can still be corrected in the collective interests of service delivery for the people.
Be that as it may, it seems like now there's a move towards the DA. There's been this recent meeting about service delivery in KwaZulu-Natal. Mhlathuze now has a deputy mayor, or will soon have a deputy mayor, DA. Are you moving towards the DA's sphere of influence, as it were, into the clutches of the Moonshot Pact?
No. We have to create governments. We've got a responsibility. Councils are hung, we are political parties in the space. I don't believe there's ideology about patching a pothole, giving people water, cleaning towns as we're doing in Umhlathuze, Escort, Vryheid, and so on. Those are basic elementary service delivery things that anybody can work together to fulfill for the people. So now, then there's this issue of the Moonshot Pact. The latest update I have is that the name Moonshot Pact is off the table, right?
Is that so?
Yes. This is
what do you make of that proposal nationally?
No. It's important to have a discussion, but the point I must make up front, the IFP is going into the 2024 elections as the IFP. We're not going as a conglomerate of other parties. Will be standing as the IFP, presenting policy alternatives, solutions to the problems as the IFP. We are not partnering, but what we do believe is necessary is a discussion in preparation for the eventuality of coalitions, because you'll also remember there's one thing that is missing in the conversation. The timelines to form government after elections are very short. So we can't have an elongated process when the timelines are moving as quickly as they are. So we've got a duty to be responsible about it.
Are you in any conversations now about governance or any early negotiations already?
No, we're not. We are establishing the principles and the parameters of engagement and looking at how this can be implemented. Again, aliki iche phezukwelinye here. So yes, we are working with the DA in some municipalities. In fact, that Umhlathuze deputy mayor position was a seat that the EFF held in a cooperation that we had with the IFP, DA, EFF, ACDP, Freedom Front Plus. So we were all there. So the vacancy must be filled. And our understanding of coalitions is that we don't take everything. We must share with the coalition partners. It's an important principle to establish because it pushes back on the notions of Big Brother syndrome. So there's a whole hullabaloo and people arriving at uninformed conclusions. We, as the party, we do believe that we've got a healthy working relationship with the DA at local government, and we will continue working. The worst part, of course, in KwaZulu-Natal is the weaponization of COGTA as an extension of the ANC in causing instability in municipalities and the blatant abuse of Section 139 by the MEC and untoward interventions. So amongst others, that's a motivating factor for us to push for the province because it's creating instability at local government level.
Can I just ask you, in terms of the national election, since we've gone there, a scenario has come to my mind, and I've always wanted to put it to an IFP leader, that yes, you're at loggerheads with the ANC and KZN, but if the ANC gets, say, 48 or 47, the IFP somewhere where it was, let's say, even 5, 6, then suddenly one of the shortest routes to a national majority for the ANC is actually, look, we'll give you KZN, give us the national government or we'll do some kind of coalition there. Have you thought about that prospect and that scenario, and is that something you would at least be willing to entertain if the ANC came to you with a deal like that?
We're not preempting the election results, so we've not had that kind of imagination. Suffice to say, the hostility of the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal, well beyond the parameters of normal day-to-day politicking, muddies the waters, not for that prospect, but for the reconciliation agenda between the IFP and the ANC, which is outstanding.
So it's not off the table. So you wouldn't rule out categorically.
What we are saying is that the parameters of engagement that are being discussed, we've got a certain set of principles: good governance, anti-corruption, service delivery, employing people who are fit for purpose. Because the first task of any government that will come in post-2024 will be to press the reset button on the governance fabric and machinery of the country. We can't continue governing with incompetence, with a climate of corruption. Government frontline services are a crime scene across the spectrum, simply because there is no due regard for governance. Now, who's in power? It's the ANC delivering that mess. So it's not one then to walk blindly into to think we will fix the problem with the causes of the problem. So I do believe that the arrogance of the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal, as I was hearing their provincial chairperson over the weekend shunning issues around discussion, is exactly because in their minds they think everything is hunky-dory. And the daily lived experience of the people speaks a different story. So we are understanding the people would be electing us in rejecting, amongst others, on top of the alternative will be presenting in rejection of the ANC. So the ANC has to change if it wants to stay in power. But selfishly, of course, if they don't change, that works for us, right? So a cool and no cool. It's their own problem. But the one warning we want to give is that don't be arrogant when you're in power. And this applies to us as well, where we are governing. And this is a message we are preaching every day to our deployees. Because we have to bridge the trust deficit towards a trust surplus between politics and the people. And political parties as a key player have to change. So right now, there's no scenario planning, whether for the DA numbers or the ANC. We will cross that bridge when we get to it. But what we're confident about is we are laying a foundation which will make it easy to make decisions in the collective interest of the people.
Absolutely. Let's go to a break. We're in conversation with National Spokesperson of the IFP, Mkhuleko Hlengwa. We've discussed governance, coalitions. When we come back from the break, we discuss political violence in KZN. Don't go anywhere. Our conversation continues after this. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're in conversation with National Spokesperson of the IFP, Mkhuleko Hlengwa. Just before we move on to questions of political violence, rounding off the coalition conversation, what did you make of Deputy President Mashatile leading this gathering about national coalitions? Do you think that's a positive step for democracy or a covert attempt to try and get parties around the ANC table?
In principle, it's good to have these discussions because we can't run away from the instability that characterizes local government and the willy-nilly nature in which things happen, without any sense and stability for the people. And it's also, I suppose, interesting to have a deputy president who's actually trying to do something and lead programs. But what we don't agree with is the threshold that is being placed for political parties.
Why is that?
Because the very nature of our democracy is inclusivity, to make sure that every voice is heard. And so when you start closing off, explicitly, then you are marginalizing. That's the first point. Secondly, it's that we can't take reactionary decisions which are seen to be opportunistic. Perception is also very important in politics. And we don't believe that people must be closed out. Obviously, the 400 seats will run until they are ended, but you must not have an exclusionary approach. Also, consensus is the very, foundation. And I always make the point that consensus takes forward 100% of the people, whereas the simplicity of 50 plus 1, you run the risk of leaving behind 49%.
How do we balance that against stability? Because there is this question of inclusivity, as you say, but then also just that government is stable and predictable. Are there any safeguards that we can still introduce to make sure that the national government doesn't go the way of Joburg or Nelson Mandela Bay? And I appreciate there are actually many other municipalities in KZN that have just succeeded as coalition governments, but there's always that fear that the national government in 2024 could be unstable.
Well, the issue is that, yes, there has to be standing orders in council and in parliament insofar as guidance and regulating the introduction of votes of no confidence, the frequency of those votes of no confidence. So there's mechanisms that can be put in place to create a sense of stability. It can't be open-ended because the revolving door, amongst others, it opens not just the door to instability, but instability creates a conducive and enabling environment for corruption. And then it eats away at any prospect of service delivery. So I think where we need to angle towards right now is ensuring that we are putting in place rules, standing orders and guidance of ensuring that the provisions that are available, legal, of change of government are done in a manner which does not interrupt service delivery to the extent which we've seen.
On the question of the IFP becoming a national party, one of the obstacles, at least in perception, is the question of political violence. The IFP is one party, a big party in KZN, where there is a lot of political violence. To what extent do you think that this political violence in KZN has something to do with the IFP, and to what extent do you take the blame for political violence in the province at the moment?
Well, it would be very difficult to take the blame, and at the same time it would be very difficult to cast the blame elsewhere, for the simple reason that we are not law enforcement agencies. And we believe that the continued killing of councillors and political leaders continues in KwaZulu-Natal specifically, and Mpumalanga and other provinces, simply because the SAPS have not done sufficient and enough work to investigate and to bring matters to a logical legal prosecution, which puts these criminals behind bars. Because you'll remember that conversation we had last week. I think it's very irresponsible and reckless for any political leader to cast aspersions on another political party, because the assumption then becomes, if you have information, why don't you give it to the police? So this thing of grandstanding for ease of popularity over the carcasses of people is wrong. So what we are calling for is that there must be, enhanced work. The 72-hour response time that the SAPS speaks about has to be beefed up. Yes, we as political parties have got a responsibility to ensure that we deploy people who are ethical, of moral authority, and are committed to serving leadership, because that is where the corruption takes place. People who won't interfere with processes. The final point is that it's obviously what we can't ignore is the link between the killings and tendering, because the tendering space in itself is an enabler for corruption and therefore the killings of people. Final point goes to the issue that was actually raised in the inset, because it speaks to the violence question. Now, you had the black-on-black low-intensity civil war in this country that killed 20,000 people, of which 12,000 were IFP people and some 600 white people. So, right? So we come as a country from a past of violence. And we need to do everything possible to clamp down on that, because one, it creates instability. Two, people who are competent and able to work as counselors or to say I'm available will not go into that space. So you are pushing back on expertise, and if we don't deal with this thing, then the mafia takes over. So ultimately, I think that KwaZulu-Natal can be an exception, insofar as what is happening. And I think that that violence notwithstanding, here we are, and we are growing as a party. So we stand opposed to this violence, and we are calling on all political parties to work together, because we are all equally affected by this thing.
So there's no doubt that other political parties have a lot to answer for. The Moerane Commission showed how a lot of violence in KZN is also internal ANC violence. Other parties certainly have their share to answer. But on the question of the IFP specifically, let's come to KwaNongoma, which was a point of debate recently, of course, because Mamtunu, a councillor there, was recently murdered. We obviously don't know by whom, but there was this voice note that was sent in warning that some have reported had links to the IFP. Are you sure that that didn't happen? And if it did happen, have there been internal steps taken to avert this kind of thing happening again?
The origins of that voice note are unknown to us. Right? We don't know who that is, and so it's subject to all kinds of speculation.
So you don't have any confirmation that
it's not. There's no confirmation that it came from the IFP. What we are calling for is for it to be investigated, because we are now being tarnished by this thing. Secondly, in Nongoma, I know this argument in some quarters is not heard. The tragic killing of Umamu Mchunu does not change the status quo of Nongoma, because one, it doesn't create a by-election. Two, the NFP will replace her. Right, so the status quo remains. We are worried as a party that this emerging violence will be a deterrent to active political participation in voting in the elections next year. So we stand nothing to gain from this violence when we are on a growth trajectory to win the province. Right? So this violence doesn't help us at all. And so that is why the police must broaden the net to see who benefits from this instability, who benefits from this violence. You look at the fact that you have got this Amatela Ngogbona phenomenon interrupting government work, and then you've got political leaders negotiating with them, and you've got some of them facilitating discussions and receiving payments of 5 million rands. So it's quite clear then to see, Uguti, you have got people who are on one mission to eat very quickly because they are on their way out, but also an election that is held in a climate of violence most likely does not benefit the contender, who in this case is us.
Do you ever feel fear, or have you ever felt as a senior IFP leader under threat?
I do. Then the IFP has provided security for me, and it's not a nice life. But at the same time, we are committed to the service and ensuring that the IFP does well. I think that all of us across the spectrum must just understand that this violence does not help anyone. I think that message, because there have to be things that unite us as political parties, right? There has to be unity against, this criminality. It's not just affecting political parties, it affects families, it affects livelihoods, it affects communities. So at the end of the day, criminality reigns supreme. Are we prepared to subject ourselves to criminality? Why should we allow that? So here, I think we must be unambiguous. The SABs must shape up. They got to do better. At the same time, where political party intervention is required, it must happen. But the law enforcement agencies are failing us.
Let's go to a break and we'll come back after that. Look at the national picture and how the IFP plans ahead of 2024 to widen its appeal as one of the opposition parties vying for electoral success. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Unfiltered. I'm in conversation with national spokesperson of the IFP, Mkhuleko Hlengwa. Let's go to some of your comments on social media. And we have from Piers a question who says, outside of KZN, has the IFP ever been able to pivot from its hostel-based strongholds in Gauteng? Is it a product of its long history of ethnic exclusivity? Let's turn to another comment. Mfanaka Gogo says, please ask him why we should vote for them if they will give our votes to the DA through a moonshot. Why did the IFP defend de Klerk when the EFF wanted him out for saying apartheid was not a crime against humanity? Doesn't this feed to what Chris Hani said about them? And finally, Mpilo says, what is the IFP's approach to appeal to the nation at large and moving away from rural and hostel-based holdings? Is the marriage with the DA really a good thing to appeal to other people? So a similar theme there about the national question, and then there was one question about the EFF and the breakdown of that relationship.
There is no doubt that apartheid was a crime against humanity. It's inexcusable, it was inhumane, and it is fundamentally the basis upon which black people found themselves previously disadvantaged and now presently disadvantaged. There is no condemnation for apartheid from the IFP. We'll never have it. But at the same time, we have to go back to the choices that were made in 1994. And those choices were choices for reconciliation. So what we should be saying is, how far have we gone with the reconciliation agenda, and is it yielding dividends which correct the atrocities of the past and the injustices and the socio-economic injustice that black people specifically had to endure? And the affirmative answer is that it has not, in large part. It's something we encourage, for there to be unity in diversity, to be the reliability and relatability amongst people, oneness of the country. But we must not be blinded to the fact that a lot of work still needs to be done to level the playing fields, to bring black people on board onto a trajectory of service delivery which restores dignity. So I'm not sure then, you see, because the thing is, Pella, it can't be that if the EFF sneezes, then we must catch the flu. If they raise a matter, they raise a matter. If we raise a matter, we raise a matter. So we can't constantly be responding to everything that they say. But on this one, there's full agreement. Apartheid was a crime against humanity. The national expansion program of the party is one which is of key priority right now, with National Council deployment teams out in full force. That's why we've been contesting by-elections in Mpumalanga, contesting by-elections in Free State and here in Gauteng. In fact, we are using it as a tool to test what it is that we need to do and how to do it better. Growth is not an event, it's a process. Right? And so as a party, we recognize that we've got our work cut out, and I do believe that we are gaining the necessary traction. Two, when, of course, at the end of September, start of October, we are going to a policy conference which is going to then give birth to the National Manifesto for the elections. And having looked at the drafts that are there, I'm quite confident that we are on the right trajectory of continuing to present to South Africans a credible and viable alternative. So that will certainly be there for South Africans to see what the IFP is doing. Finally, on the questions, the working relationship with the DA and other parties, by the way. In Newcastle, we are working with Team Sugar South Africa, we are working with Action SA. So it must not be seen to be one party. And we've got a responsibility. So I must emphasize this. We've got a responsibility to form governments. And we have to say, yes, there are areas where we agree and areas where we disagree. That's why we worked with the DA and EFF in the coalitions that we had until they pulled out. And so that's a new phenomenon. In 2016, you had the IFP and the EFF supporting DA governments. So there's fluidity in this space. And why? Because governments must be formed.
In terms of the policy trajectory of the party, I hear that you're going to your policy conference or gathering where you're going to craft your trajectory. But there's this question that's going to loom over 2024, which is, on the one hand, we need service delivery, we need government to be clean, effective and efficient. But on the other hand, we've got these historical inequalities, especially around questions of race, but also around other questions. How do you, as the IFP, square that circle? Do you believe that redress-based policies, which have come under attack from some quarters, are the answer to that? Or do you believe we should move away from them? Where do you stand on that spectrum and around that key question?
Unity and diversity, social cohesion and nation building notwithstanding, and reconciliation, we cannot be ignorant to the fact that apartheid was race-based, and therefore to correct its effects and atrocities, there has to be race-based outlook and race-based solutions. There's no way around it. But it does not mean that you do that by undoing others. It does not mean you're taking away from others. We have to, and it goes to the issue of economic growth and economic development. It goes to addressing the issues of spatial planning. The Cape Town problem right now of the taxi strike, the people bearing the brutal brunt of that are those who live outside the centers of economic activity, black people. Why? Because the spatial planning of the past excluded them from the spaces where the economy is working. So it means there has to be a heightened focus of development, service delivery, growth in the areas where people are. The IFP as a federal party is committed to the notion that if all development is local and all politics therefore must be local, we must develop people where they are. And that goes without saying that there will be a bias towards previously disadvantaged and presently disadvantaged. I think it would be dishonest of us to not recognize that the problems which we have and that the basis of apartheid was race, and then think we will resolve race-based atrocities, challenges and exclusion by any other mechanism which does not factor in race. But at the same time, we must continue, the gospel of reconciliation, working together as a people. Everybody's got a contribution to make. That's what nation building is about. It's about those who have actively participating, in the solutions. So for the IFP, there is no way forward without considering that. But we must also be honest to the notion that there have been abuses to race-based policies insofar as them being contaminated by corruption. So I think that must be corrected, that it's probably not the policy that's the problem, it's the implementation. And that's why I was saying earlier on, the first order of business is pressing the reset button on the governance trajectory of this country.
Let's go to our poll for the evening. Can the IFP achieve national growth? 72% say no, 27% say yes, but Mr. Hlengwa will say that the 165 votes do not represent a national sample. So,
well, I will say that polls have never favored us, but at every turn we have proven them wrong.
The poll you care about is 2024.
That's the poll, and our growth right now is a positive one, but it does not mean we must discount the fact that work must be done. I think I'll only conclude by saying, Principal Teles has always made the notion that if you are working and you feel tired, that's only when the work starts. So that is the kind of motivation that we have, and I'm appealing to those who've said no to join us, to partner with us in this national endeavor of ensuring that we fix the country for the better.
Mr. Hlekwa, thank you for joining us on Unfiltered. Towas. Thank you very much for joining us on Unfiltered. Can the IFP become a truly national party? That's the question we've asked this evening. We've discussed its governance in KZN, its policies, and also the questions of leadership. Let's continue this conversation on social media, and don't forget to join us again on another installment of Unfiltered News, Unfiltered Views, and Unfiltered Conversations. Have a good night.